Claire held the uniform jacket up with 2 fingers. Moth-eaten, faded, missing buttons. The whole thing smelled of cedar and decades. "Ma'am, this is a display piece at best. I can't put this in a catalogue." The old woman didn't reach for it. She said, "Check the left pocket first." Claire put her hand in the pocket. She felt paper, thick paper, folded small. She took it out, unfolded it, read the first line, read it again. She looked up at the old woman. She said, "I need to make a phone call." Before that afternoon ended, 2 men in civilian clothes would arrive at the auction house. The jacket would be placed in an evidence bag, and the old woman who had been carrying what was in that pocket for 30 years would sit in the waiting area with her hands in her lap while people around her tried to understand what they were suddenly in the middle of. What was in that pocket? And who was she? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some things are kept for exactly as long as they need to be, subscribe. Harwick Auction House occupied a converted warehouse on the west side of the city, a building that had been a textile storage facility in the 1940s and had become, through a series of transformations, one of the region's more respected mid-market auction houses, not the grand metropolitan operations that handled estate jewelry and museum deaccession pieces, but serious enough, serious about provenance, serious about authentication, serious about the specific work of correctly understanding what an object was before assigning it a value. Claire Drummond was 29 years old and had been working at Harwick for 3 years, since completing a graduate degree in material culture that had given her a theoretical framework for objects and a practical need for employment that the auction house had helpfully addressed. She was the junior appraiser, which meant she handled the initial assessments, the walk-ins, the estate inquiries, the people who arrived with family heirlooms and garage sale finds, and the occasional piece of genuine significance. She was good at the work. She had an eye, which was the quality the work ultimately required above all others. The ability to look at an object and see it accurately, to separate what it appeared to be from what it was. She was still developing the depth of knowledge that made the eye reliable across wide categories. She knew certain areas well: ceramics, some furniture, decorative arts of the mid-20th century. She knew military material culture less well, which was why the jacket had presented as less than it was when she first picked it up. She would not make that mistake again. The old woman had called ahead. Her name, given at the front desk, was Margaret Voss. She had an appointment at 2:30. She arrived at 2:28, which Claire noted as the punctuality of someone who had been thinking about this appointment for longer than the morning. She sat across from Claire at the appraisal table with the jacket in a plain paper carrier bag on the chair beside her. She had removed it herself, both hands, the deliberateness that Claire had noted. She had placed it on the table with the left side up, which Claire registered only later as intentional. Claire had picked it up, assessed it, concluded. And then the old woman had said, "Check the left pocket first." The document was folded in quarters. When unfolded, it was a single sheet of heavy paper, approximately A4 in size, the kind used for official correspondence. The paper had aged, yellowed at the edges, faintly foxed, the fold lines darkened, but the content was completely legible, clear, dense type. A letterhead at the top that Claire read once and then read again more slowly, parsing the specific language of it. The letterhead was military, not a standard military branch designation, something more specific, a unit designation, an alphanumeric that meant nothing to Claire from memory, but which she photographed immediately with her phone, the way she photographed everything in an appraisal. Below the letterhead, a date, March 1983. Below the date, a body of text that Claire read in full, standing at the appraisal table, the jacket beside her, and Margaret Voss across from her. The document described an operation. Not in detail. The text was careful, the language of someone writing for an official record while aware that the record might be read by people who should not know everything. But the outline was clear. a specific operation, a specific theater, a specific outcome. And at the bottom, a summary statement that Claire read 3 times before she was certain she had read it correctly. The summary statement said, "Operator confirmed deceased in operation. Identity to be withheld from official casualty record per Directive 7C. No notification to family, no official record of operation. Operator's service to be recorded as administrative discharge, March 1983. Below that, 2 signatures, and a classification marking that Claire recognized from the reference material she had studied for exactly this kind of situation. A classification marking indicating that the document was not to be entered into any accessible record. Claire looked at the document, at the jacket, at Margaret Voss. She said, "I need to make a phone call." She called her manager first. Not the authentication specialist, not the military material consultant she used for pieces requiring expertise she didn't have. Her manager, because what she was looking at had moved outside the category of appraisal and into a category she was not equipped to navigate alone. Her manager, a man named David Hale, who had been running Harwick for 16 years and who had the specific quality of someone who had seen most things that could happen in an auction house and had developed a protocol for all of them, listened to her description from the doorway of his office with an expression that went through several stages before settling into something she read as carefully controlled. He said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't photograph anything else. Sit with her and don't let her leave. I'm making a call." The call he made was not to an authentication specialist. 22 minutes later, 2 men in civilian clothes arrived at the front entrance of Harwick Auction House. They wore the kind of unremarkable clothing that communicated nothing specific and everything general. They spoke with Hale for 19 minutes. Hale came to the appraisal room where Claire was sitting across from Margaret Voss. He said, "Claire, I need you to step out for a moment." She stepped out. She stood in the corridor for 30 minutes. She was not told anything. At the end of the 30 minutes, Hale came back. He said, "They'd like to speak with the woman who brought the jacket. She's agreed to speak with them. You can take a break. This is going to take some time." Claire went to the staff kitchen, made coffee, sat at the small table, and tried to process what she had read standing at the appraisal table. Operator confirmed deceased in operation. Identity to be withheld from official casualty record. No notification to family. No official record of operation. She thought about the jacket, about the missing insignia, the frayed thread at the attachment points suggesting it had been removed with force or haste, about the removed rank markings, about a uniform from which all identifying information had been stripped except for what was in the left pocket. Except for what was in the left pocket. Someone had put that document in the pocket deliberately. Someone had kept the jacket with the document inside it deliberately. For 30 years. She thought about Margaret Voss, about the pewter eyes and the careful deliberateness with which she had placed the jacket on the table, about the way she had said, "Check the left pocket first," not asking, stating, the way someone states a fact they have been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to deliver. She got the story in pieces, not that day. Over the following weeks, in the specific way that things unfold when they involve institutional processes that move carefully and people who have been holding things carefully for a long time. The first piece came from Margaret Voss herself, in a conversation that Claire had not expected to be permitted to have, and which Hale had arranged with the specific discretion of someone managing a sensitive situation who understood that the person who had initially received the object deserved to understand what the object was. They sat in Hale's office, Claire and Margaret, while Hale was elsewhere. Margaret had a cup of tea she didn't drink. Claire had a notepad she didn't use. Margaret said, "My brother's name was Thomas Voss. He enlisted in 1975. He was 20 years old. He served for 8 years. She looked at the window. She said, "In March 1983, my family received a letter from the army saying Thomas had been administratively discharged, not killed in action. Not missing, discharged. Administrative reasons, the letter said. We didn't understand. We wrote back. We received a form letter. We called. We were told the information available was in the letter. She paused. She said, Thomas never came home. He never wrote. He never called. For 30 years, we believed. We didn't know what to believe. Administrative discharge was not an explanation. It was an absence of explanation dressed in official language. She looked at her hands. She said, My mother died in 2001 not knowing what happened to her son. My father died in 2009 the same way. I have spent 30 years trying to find an answer and finding walls. Claire said, And the jacket? Margaret said, Arrived in the mail. No return address. A week after my father died in 2009. Just the jacket in a box. Plain brown paper wrapping. My name and address on the outside. Nothing else. No note. She looked at the jacket, which was now in the evidence bag on the table beside her. She said, I found the document in the pocket that evening. I read it. I sat with it for a very long time, and then I put it back in the pocket and I closed the box and I kept it. Claire said, For 15 years. Margaret said, For 15 years. Claire said, Why? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, Because I didn't know what to do with it. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I brought it somewhere. Because every time I had approached official channels in 30 years, I had found a wall. Because the document said explicitly that there would be no official record. She said, and because I wasn't ready. My father had just died. My mother was gone. I was the last one. And I wasn't ready to find out definitively, one way or the other, what had happened to Thomas. Because as long as I didn't know definitively, there was still the specific kind of hope that exists in the space between not knowing and knowing. Claire looked at the evidence bag. She said, What made you ready now? Margaret said, I'm 73 years old. I don't have indefinitely, and if I die with that jacket in a box, the document goes with me. And whatever Thomas did, whatever happened to him, whatever he was part of, it disappears entirely, as if he never existed, as if he never served, as if the letter they sent my family was the true account. She looked at Claire. She said, I couldn't let that be the end of it. The second piece came from the two men who had arrived in civilian clothes, through hail, filtered through the specific language of institutional communication about sensitive matters. Their names were not given. Their organization was described only as a review office attached to a department whose name Hale passed on to Claire in a voice that suggested he was not entirely certain of the pronunciation. They had been apparently expecting something like this for some years. Not this specifically. Not a jacket with a document in a pocket arriving at an auction house. But they had been aware that certain materials from the period in question had been incompletely collected when the programs involved were closed, and they had maintained a watch for anything from those programs surfacing through civilian channels. The program in question, the document's origin, had been a specific type of operation run between 1979 and 1984, operating in locations that the review office described to Hale as complex environments, which Hale translated for Claire as places that were officially not there and periods that were officially not happening. Thomas Voss had been part of this program from 1980 to 1983. His role had been, in the careful language of the review office's communication, high-value direct action, which translated, with the help of a reference document that Claire spent an evening reading, into the specific type of work that certain operators did in certain environments during a certain period of American military activity that the official history of the period had managed without mentioning. He had died in March 1983, in a location the review office declined to specify, doing something the review office declined to describe. The document in the jacket was authentic. The review office had confirmed this. It was one of several documents from the program that had been lost when the program was closed and the records were being managed. Managed being the institutional word for a process that had involved, based on what Claire could piece together from the communications she was permitted to see, the controlled destruction of most of the program's documentation. Someone had kept this document, had kept it for 26 years, and then sent it to the last surviving family member. The review office did not know who had sent it. The review office was, apparently, conducting a parallel inquiry into that question. What they did know, and what they communicated to Hale for transmission to Margaret Voss, was that Thomas Voss's service record was being reviewed, that the administrative discharge designation was being reconsidered, that a process was underway. The process took 11 months. During those 11 months, Claire received periodic updates from Hale, who received them from the review office through channels that had been established for this specific purpose. The updates were brief and careful and conveyed information without fully explaining it, which was the nature of institutional communication about matters that remained sensitive even as their most sensitive period was receding into the past. She passed the updates to Margaret Voss, who came to the auction house once a month. Not for appraisals, for the updates. She would sit in the same chair in Hale's office, and Claire would tell her what she knew, and Margaret would listen with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, processing rather than reacting. During these monthly visits, Claire learned more of Thomas Voss in fragments. He had been born in 1955, the younger of 2 children. He had been, Margaret said, the kind of person who did things fully, who committed completely to whatever he was committed to, who had no middle setting. He had enlisted because he believed in what the service represented, in the direct and uncomplicated way of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned that the institution and the ideal were different things. He had been good at what they asked him to do, in the program. Margaret said this without elaborating on what she knew about what they had asked him to do, and Claire did not press her, understanding that there was a specific knowledge Margaret carried about her brother's final years that she had assembled from the document and from 30 years of thinking about it, and that this knowledge was hers to hold in whatever form she could hold it. He had liked chess, Margaret said. He had learned to cook during the time he was at home on leave between deployments, which was brief and which he had spent in the family kitchen teaching himself techniques from library cookbooks. He had been funny in the specific way of people who are serious about important things and use humor to manage the weight of that seriousness. He had sent a postcard from somewhere in 1982. Just a scene, a landscape, mountains, she thought, though the postcard hadn't said where it was from. On the back, his handwriting, "Thinking of you, still working." T. She still had the postcard. She showed it to Claire once, in the 4th monthly visit. The handwriting of someone who wrote with the efficiency of someone accustomed to writing under difficult conditions. Small, precise, no wasted strokes. Claire looked at the postcard, thought about a man in 1982 finding a postcard and writing 4 words on the back and sending it from somewhere that was officially not there to a sister who would spend the next 40 years looking for him. The determination came on a Thursday in November. Not in person, in writing, from the review office, through Hale, delivered to Margaret Voss in the same office where they had been meeting monthly for 11 months. Claire was present. Hale was present. Margaret sat in the same chair. The letter was formal and carefully worded. It acknowledged the circumstances of Thomas Voss's service. It acknowledged the circumstances of his death. It withdrew the administrative discharge designation and replaced it with the correct designation for what had actually occurred, which was death in the line of duty during a classified operation in March 1983. It confirmed that his name would be added to the appropriate memorial. It confirmed that his service record would be corrected in the official archive. It confirmed that a posthumous commendation was being considered. And it contained a specific paragraph that Claire read carefully and that Margaret asked her to read aloud. Claire read, "The department acknowledges that the absence of notification to next of kin following the death of Sergeant Thomas Voss in March 1983 was incorrect. The administrative process employed was not consistent with the obligations owed to service members and their families. The department expresses its formal acknowledgement of this failure and its regret for the impact this failure had on the Voss family. Margaret listened to the paragraph. Then she was quiet for a long time. Hale looked at the window. Claire looked at the table. Margaret said, "Formal acknowledgement, not apology." Claire said, "No, not apology." Margaret said, "But acknowledgement." Claire said, "Yes." Margaret was quiet again, long enough that Claire began to wonder whether the letter had given her what she needed or had confirmed that what she needed was something the letter could not provide. Then Margaret said, "It's enough. It's not everything, but it's enough." She picked up the letter, folded it once, put it in her coat pocket. She said, "His name will be on the memorial." Claire said, "Yes." She said, "People will be able to look it up, see that he served, see what he did, in the terms they're willing to say publicly." Claire said, "Yes." Margaret said, "He won't be the administrative discharge anymore. He won't be the absence of explanation." Claire said, "No." Margaret nodded once, the nod of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has now received it and is registering the reception. She said, "I want to tell you something. About the jacket." Claire waited. She said, "Thomas had a habit. When he was young, before he enlisted, he always kept something in his left pocket. Not his wallet, not his keys. Something specific to the day, to what he was doing, to wherever he was. A stone he'd found on a walk, a matchbook from somewhere he'd been, a piece of paper with something written on it. He said it was how he kept track of where he'd been, a physical record of each day." She looked at the evidence bag, still on the table from the monthly meetings. She said, "Whoever sent me the jacket knew that. Whoever put the document in the left pocket knew that habit. They knew that if Thomas kept something, it went in the left pocket. And they were telling me where to look." Claire thought about this, about someone knowing Thomas Voss well enough to know his habit, about keeping a document for 26 years and then sending it to his sister with the information encoded in where the document was placed. She said, "Do you know who sent it?" Margaret said, "I have a theory. Someone who served with him, someone who was there or close enough to there to have the document and to know the habit. Someone who survived and kept the document and waited until the last family member was the only one left to receive it." She said, "I'll probably never know for certain. And I think whoever it was knew I probably wouldn't. I think they were okay with that. I think they just needed it to be somewhere, in the right hands, so that it could eventually get to the right place." She stood up. She said, "Thank you, for not dismissing it entirely, for making the call." Claire said, "You said check the left pocket first. I'm glad I listened." Margaret said, "I've been saying it for 15 years. To every appraiser, every historian, every official channel I've tried. Everyone told me the jacket wasn't worth anything. You were the first person who actually checked." She said goodbye to Claire and goodbye to Hale and walked out through the auction house to the street. Claire kept thinking about the left pocket, not about the document specifically. The document had gone where documents like that go, into a process that had produced an outcome, the outcome that Margaret had needed. She thought about the left pocket as a concept, about the habit of keeping something specific, something physical, somewhere intentional, as a way of maintaining a record of where you'd been. She thought about what it meant that someone had put the document there, not in a sealed envelope, not in a separate container, in the pocket where Thomas Voss had kept things he wanted to remember, where someone who knew him would know to look. It was, she thought, a form of communication across time, a message sent by someone who understood that the message would only reach its destination if the recipient knew where to look. She thought about appraisal work, about the specific skill of knowing where to look, which was different from knowing what to look for, which was different again from knowing how to look. The skill was layered, and the layers took time to develop, and the deepest layer was the one she was still learning, the layer that said the object will tell you what it is if you know where to look. The left pocket. She had almost not checked. She had been about to dismiss the jacket entirely, to give the polite no, to return it to the paper carrier bag, to move on to the next appointment. Two things had stopped her: the way Margaret Voss had said it, and the specific quality of attention Margaret Voss had brought to placing the jacket on the table. Both of those things were visible before the document was. Both of them were information about the jacket that was not in the jacket itself, but in the way the jacket had been presented, and she had almost missed them. She had developed, over the following months, a habit. Before she concluded an initial assessment, she asked herself one question: is there something in the way this object was presented to me that I haven't factored into my assessment of it? Sometimes the answer was no. Most of the time the answer was no. The object was what it appeared to be, and the assessment was complete. But sometimes, rarely, in the way that genuinely rare things were rare, the answer was yes. And on those occasions, she checked the left pocket. Whatever the left pocket was for that particular object, whatever the equivalent of the fold in the document, the placement on the table, the deliberate way of presenting something that said, "I know where the thing that matters is, and I'm telling you where to look." She checked, always, before concluding. Thomas Voss's name was added to the memorial in April. Margaret attended the ceremony alone. She had told Claire about it afterward in a phone call that was brief in the way of people who have been through something significant and are not yet sure how much of it they want to describe. She said, "It's there. I stood in front of it for a long time." Claire said, "How did it feel?" Margaret said, "Like the thing that needed to happen had happened. Not like the ending of something, more like the correct filing of something, like a record being put where it belongs." She said, "He was real. He served. He did something. It happened. And now it's in the record, however incomplete the record is, however much it still can't say. It's there." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I took a photograph of it, of his name. I'll send it to you." Claire said, "I'd like that." The photograph arrived that afternoon. A memorial wall, stone, names in rows, the specific formal precision of a permanent record. And in the photograph, slightly off-center, slightly out of focus because Margaret had taken it with a phone held at an angle that suggested she had been closer to the wall than the camera's focal range preferred, Thomas Voss's name, in the same font as the names around it, no different in appearance from any of them, carrying no visible indication of the 30 years it had taken to arrive there. Claire looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she printed it. She put it in the file she had been building since the afternoon Margaret Voss had walked through the door with a paper carrier bag. The document copies, the review office correspondence, the notes from the monthly meetings, the postcard description, the file that represented the longest and most significant appraisal she had ever done, and which had begun with her picking up a jacket with 2 fingers and calling it a display piece at best. She put the photograph at the front of the file. Thomas Voss, Sergeant, 1955-1983, served, the left pocket. She went back to work. Have you ever dismissed something before you understood what it was? Have you ever been the person who almost missed something that turned out to matter more than anything else that day? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe that some things are kept for exactly as long as they need to be and then delivered to exactly the right place, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more left pockets, more objects that carry more than they appear to carry, more people who knew where to tell someone to look. Check the left pocket first. End of story. The left pocket. 50,000 characters. Original work. 3 months after the memorial ceremony, a man came into Harwick auction house. He was perhaps 65, perhaps 70. Medium height, the kind of build that had once been athletic and had settled into something solid without losing its fundamental quality. Short grey hair, cut close. eyes that moved around the room when he entered in the specific systematic way that Claire had come to associate with people who had spent significant parts of their lives in environments where assessing a room was not optional. He asked for her by name. The front desk sent him to the appraisal room. He sat down across from her at the appraisal table. He had nothing with him, no bag, no object to appraise. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at her. He said, "You're the appraiser who handled the Voss jacket." She said, "Yes." He said, "I sent it." Claire looked at him, at the grey hair and the systematic eyes and the hands flat on the table. She said, "Margaret Voss had a theory that it was someone who served with her brother, someone who survived." He said, "Yes." She said, "You kept the document for 26 years. He said, "I kept it until the time was right. Thomas's parents were alive. I couldn't bring this to them. It would have destroyed them without giving them anything that could compensate for the destruction. And then his father died, and I thought, now." But Margaret wasn't ready. I could see that she wasn't ready. I had ways of knowing, without making contact, whether she was in a position to receive this. And she wasn't ready for several more years. And then her position changed, and I sent it. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without embellishment, the language of someone who has spent a lifetime communicating information efficiently. Claire said, "You knew the left pocket." He said, "Thomas and I served together for 2 years. I knew every habit he had. The left pocket was the most consistent one. He always had something there. I knew if Margaret found the jacket, she would find the document. And if she found the document, she'd know where it came from." He paused. He said, "I also knew that she would need to find it somewhere specific. Not just receive it in the mail, receive it in the context of someone verifying what it was. Someone who would look at it with professional attention and understand what they were looking at and do what needed to be done." Claire said, "You sent it to an auction house deliberately." He said, "I sent it to a specific auction house, one that I had researched, one that had a reputation for careful authentication work on difficult provenance questions. And I sent it when you were working there because I had read your graduate work on material culture and object provenance, and I thought you had the specific kind of attention the jacket required." Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "You read my graduate work." He said, "I spent 26 years preparing this. I wasn't going to trust it to chance at the last stage." She looked at him, at the hands flat on the table, at the grey hair and the systematic eyes. She said, "Does Margaret know you came here?" He said, "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I want to say something that isn't in any official record and won't be. About Thomas." She waited. He said, "Thomas Voss was the best person I have ever worked alongside. In 2 years of work that I am not going to describe to you, in conditions that I am not going to describe to you, he was precise, and he was patient, and he was funny in the specific way of people who are serious about the things that matter and use humor to manage the weight of that seriousness. He did what was asked of him. He did it completely. He was good at it. And he died doing it in March 1983. And there was no record and there was no notification. And I spent 26 years carrying that." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The memorial. His name on the memorial. The corrected record. That's the thing I was carrying this for. Not the institutional acknowledgement. The specific fact of his name being somewhere permanent. Somewhere someone could see it." He said, "I saw the photograph Margaret sent you. She sent me a copy too. His name on the wall." He looked at the table. He said, "That's what the left pocket was for, to get his name on that wall." Claire looked at him. She thought about the jacket in the paper carrier bag, about the 2 fingers she had held it up with, about the polite no she had been preparing. She said, "I almost didn't check the pocket." He said, "But you did." She said, "Margaret said check the left pocket first. I couldn't not." He said, "That's what she was supposed to say. That's what I told her to say, in the note I included in the box when I sent the jacket. Check the left pocket first. Because I knew she would say it exactly the way I needed it said. Because Margaret Voss, whatever else she has been through in 30 years, knows how to deliver information." He stood up. He said, "I'm going to contact her. Tell her I came here. Tell her what I told you. She deserves to know who sent it." He said, "Thank you for checking the pocket." He left. Claire sat at the appraisal table for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the warehouse windows at the angle it always came through at this time of day. The auction house around her continued its ordinary work. The cataloguing, the preparation, the continuous assessment of what things were and what they were worth. She thought about Thomas Voss's name on the wall, about 26 years of carrying a document in the specific hope that it would eventually reach the right person who would do the right thing with it, about the specific kind of faith that was, not in any institution, not in any process, but in the eventual convergence of the right object and the right hands and the right moment, about a jacket in a paper carrier bag, about 2 fingers and a polite no, and a woman with pewter eyes who said, "Check the left pocket first." She went back to the queue. The next appraisal was waiting. She assessed it the way she now assessed everything, completely, before concluding. Looking at the object and at the way the object had been presented and at the person who had presented it. Looking at the left pocket, whatever the left pocket was, before concluding. Margaret Voss called in June. She had spoken with the man who had sent the jacket. She had known, she said, from the moment he called. Had known the voice. Had known in the first sentence who it was, from a description Thomas had once given her of someone he worked alongside. A description she had kept in the way you keep descriptions of important people you never met. She said, "He told me he went to see you. That he told you what he told you." Claire said, "Yes." Margaret said, "I want to ask you something. When you received the jacket, when I put it on the table and you picked it up, what was your first impression?" Claire thought about the moth-eaten wool, the missing buttons, the faded color, the smell of cedar and decades. She said, "My first impression was that it had no value." Margaret said, "And your second?" Claire said, "My second impression was that you had placed it on the table with a specific care that wasn't consistent with bringing something worthless to an appraisal. And that made me pause." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She said, "Thomas used to say something. When we were children, when he was teaching me chess, he taught me chess when I was 11, he was 14, he was very patient about it. He used to say, 'The most important move on the board is rarely the one that looks most powerful. It's usually the quiet one, the one that's been there the whole time.'" She said, "I've thought about that for 30 years, about the quiet things that have been there the whole time." She said, "His name is on the wall. The record is correct. The document is where it belongs. And it happened because you looked at the way I placed the jacket on the table before you finished deciding what the jacket was." She said, "The quiet move." Claire sat with that for a moment, the auction house around her, the afternoon light, the queue waiting on the next table. She said, "I'll remember that." Margaret said, "Good." She said goodbye. She hung up. Claire looked at the next object in the queue. She picked it up. She looked at it fully, the object itself, the way it had been presented, the person who had brought it in. She looked for the quiet move. She always would. The auction house held its annual review in September. It was an internal event. The staff, the appraisers, the specialists who consulted for Howick on specific categories. Hale ran it the way he ran everything, efficiently, without pretension, focused on what had worked and what needed to work better. He asked Claire to present the Voss jacket case, not in detail. She was not permitted to describe everything she knew, and she would not have described everything she knew regardless. But the outline, the appraisal process, the decision to check the left pocket, the subsequent events. She had prepared for 2 evenings. She had notes. She did not use them. She said, "I picked the jacket up with 2 fingers and called it a display piece at best. I had assessed it in approximately 90 seconds and formed a conclusion that was incorrect in the most important dimension. The conclusion was not entirely wrong. The jacket as an object, absent context and provenance, was what I said it was. The conclusion was incomplete. I had assessed the object without adequately assessing the context in which the object had been presented to me." She looked at the people in the room. She said, "The person who brought the jacket placed it on the table with a care that was inconsistent with bringing something of no value to an appraisal. I noticed this. I almost disregarded it. I was 2 sentences into a polite no when something made me pause." She said, "What made me pause was 3 words. Check the left pocket first." Said in a specific way, not as a request, not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. The way someone states a fact they have been carrying for a long time. She said, "I checked the left pocket. What I found there changed everything about the appraisal and led to an 11-month process and resulted in a correct official record for someone who had been incorrectly recorded for 30 years. She paused. She said, "What I've been thinking about since is the gap between the 90-second assessment and the complete assessment. That gap was almost the difference between a record that was corrected and a record that remained incorrect. The gap was, I hadn't finished looking." She said, "I've developed a practice since then. Before concluding any assessment, I ask myself one question. Have I finished looking? Not have I looked. Have I finished? Is there anything about the way this object arrived at my table, about the person who brought it, about the care or carelessness with which it was presented, that I haven't factored into my assessment?" She said, "Most of the time the answer is yes, I've finished. Most of the time the object is what it appears to be, and the assessment is complete. But the cost of asking the question when it's not necessary is 30 extra seconds. The cost of not asking it when it is necessary, in the right case, in the case that matters, can be 30 years. She stopped. The room was quiet for a moment. Hale said, "Any questions?" Several people had questions. They were good questions, practical, specific, about the process of developing the habit, about how to know when additional looking was warranted, about the line between necessary caution and excessive delay. Claire answered them as well as she could, which was incompletely, because the answer was not a procedure that could be taught in a presentation. The answer was a quality of attention that developed with practice, and the practice took time, and the time required patience with the incompleteness of early attempts. She said, "You'll get it wrong sometimes. You'll check the left pocket and find nothing. You'll spend time on a complete assessment of a jacket that turns out to be exactly what it appeared to be. And that's fine. That's the cost of the practice. The cost is worth it." She sat down. Hale moved to the next item on the agenda. The auction house continued its ordinary work. In November, the review office sent a final communication through Hale, not to Margaret, to Claire. A brief letter, formal, thanking her for her role in facilitating the resolution of the matter in question, noting that the information she had processed had contributed to a correct outcome. At the bottom of the letter, a handwritten addition in a different hand from the typed text. Whoever had typed the letter had not written the addition. The addition was in a small, precise hand that Claire recognized from the postcard Margaret had shown her, from the brief description of Thomas Voss's handwriting. It said, "His name is on the wall. Thank you for looking." It was not signed. Claire read it twice. Then she put it in the file, at the back, behind the memorial photograph. She closed the file. She sat at the appraisal table. The afternoon light through the warehouse windows. The queue waiting. The ordinary work continuing. She thought about the left pocket, about the habit of keeping something specific there, something physical, as a record of where you'd been, about a man who had kept that habit through everything, through the training, through the deployments, through the work she would never fully know, and whose sister had known the habit and had told the appraiser where to look. Check the left pocket first. She thought about what was in her own left pocket. She didn't usually keep anything there, but since September, since the annual review presentation, she had started keeping something. Not always the same thing. Something specific to the week, to what she was working on, to wherever her attention had been. A note, a photograph, a reference card with a marking she was trying to learn, a small physical record of where she'd been, what she'd been paying attention to. It was, she had realized, the same habit, modified, translated, applied to a different kind of work, but the same fundamental thing. Keep something in the left pocket. Keep track of where you've been. Let the keeping be a form of attention. She reached into her left pocket. The reference card was there. The marking she was working on this week, a specific type of manufacturer's mark on late Victorian silverware that she had been trying to memorize accurately. She took it out, looked at it, put it back. She picked up the next piece in the queue. She looked at it fully, at the object, and at the way it had been presented, and at the context it had arrived in. She asked herself, have I finished looking? Not yet. She kept looking. She kept the habit. Winter came to the city. The auction house continued. Estates came in. Collections came in. The individual objects that people carried through their lives and then needed to understand or move on from came in. Claire worked through the queue. She was not in a hurry. She had learned, since the jacket, that the queue would always be there, that the work was continuous rather than finite, and that the quality of each assessment mattered more than the speed of completing the sequence. She had a new habit in initial assessments. Before she picked up an object, she looked at the person who had brought it, not evaluating them, looking. The specific, complete looking that took in the quality of their attention, the care or absence of care with which they had arrived, the particular way they placed the object on the table. Most of the time, this additional observation changed nothing. The person was what they appeared to be. A family member with an heirloom, a collector with a question, someone who had found something and needed to know what it was. The object was what it appeared to be. The assessment was complete. But sometimes, the way that genuine exceptions are genuinely rare, the observation added something. A quality of deliberateness in the placement. A specific manner of waiting that said, this person knows something about this object that they haven't told me yet. When she noticed that quality, she looked at the object differently. She asked, what else might this be? She looked at the parts other eyes might pass over. She checked the left pocket. She had found nothing significant in 7 months since the jacket. Several complete assessments of objects that had turned out to be exactly what they appeared to be. One piece that had required additional authentication and had turned out to be authentic in a way she had suspected but needed to confirm. Nothing on the order of the jacket, but she kept looking. The habit was its own reward, not in dramatic discoveries, but in the quality of attention it required, the way it kept her present in each assessment rather than processing on autopilot, the way it made the work more honest because she was actually doing it rather than approximately doing it. Hale noticed. He mentioned it once in the corridor. You've slowed down. She said, I've become more thorough. He said, same thing. Keep it. She kept it. In January, a young man came in with a box of his grandmother's jewelry. Standard estate appraisal, the kind Claire had done many times. He was perhaps 25, slightly nervous in the way of someone who is doing something formal for the first time, with the specific quality of someone who had been told by his family to handle this and was trying to handle it correctly. He placed the box on the table. Then, before Claire could open it, he said, My grandmother said to tell you, she said to tell whoever did this appraisal, that the brooch at the bottom of the box is not what it looks like. Claire looked at him. She said, What does it look like? He said, "It looks like a cheap paste piece." She said it always looked cheap. She said that's the point of it. He said, "She said to look at the back of the setting. That's where the thing that matters is." Claire looked at the box, at the young man, at his slightly nervous expression and his good faith effort to deliver the message correctly. She opened the box. She worked through the contents systematically. The brooch was at the bottom, as he had said. It looked, as he had said, like a cheap paste piece. Glass stones in a base metal setting, the kind of thing sold in department stores in the mid-20th century for modest amounts. She turned it over. On the back of the setting, scratched by hand with something fine, a needle perhaps or a pin, 3 letters and a date. The letters were a maker's mark that Claire did not recognize. She photographed it. She photographed the construction of the setting, the specific way the prongs had been formed, the small details of workmanship that the front of the piece had obscured behind its deliberately cheap appearance. She spent that evening with the reference materials. She sent the photograph to 3 colleagues in different specialties. By the following morning, she had the answer. The brooch was not paste. The brooch was one of a small number of pieces made between 1938 and 1941 by a specific maker whose workshop had been in Vienna, who had disguised valuable pieces as cheap jewelry to enable their transport across borders during a period when such transport was otherwise impossible. The glass stones were glass. The setting was base metal. The value was in what the piece was, not what it was made of. The grandmother had known, had kept it for 80 years, looking cheap, carrying its history invisibly. She had told her grandson to tell the appraiser to look at the back of the setting. Claire called the young man, told him what she had found. The silence on the line was long. He said, "She said it was important. I didn't understand why she was so specific about it." Claire said, "She knew where to tell you to look." He said, "She always did." Claire asked him to come back in. There was more to discuss: the full assessment, the provenance documentation, the process for confirming and recording what she had found. He came back the following day. She walked him through it. When he left, he turned at the door and said, "How did you know to check? I mean, I told you to look at the back, but how did you know to actually look?" Claire thought about this, about a jacket in a paper carrier bag, about 3 words, about the habit she had developed since. She said, "Someone told me once that some things only show their value from the back, and that you have to know to look there before you can see it." He said, "Who told you that?" She said, "A woman who had been carrying something for 30 years and needed someone to finally check the left pocket." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded in the way of someone who doesn't fully understand, but recognizes that they are in the presence of something worth not fully understanding. He left. Claire went back to the queue. The afternoon light was the specific January light of a city in the Northern Hemisphere. Flat, honest, the light of a season that stripped things back to their essential character and showed them as they were. She picked up the next piece. She looked at it fully, at the object and at the person who had brought it, and at the context it had arrived in, and at the places other eyes might pass over. She asked herself, "Have I finished looking?" She had not. She kept looking. That was the practice. That was the whole of it. Not a revelation, not a dramatic discovery. The daily discipline of finishing the looking before concluding applied to each object in the queue in the specific honest light of the work. She kept the habit. She always would.